Thank you so much, Mary. I'm really happy to have the chance to be here with you all tonight to talk about what's probably my favorite subject in the world, which is tidal swamps of the Oregon coast. These little-known forests of the tidelands are magnificent indeed, and I want to tell you about their past and their present. I want to thank the organizations that sponsored my talk today. My own organization is the Institute for Applied Ecology. We're a small nonprofit here in Corvallis. 500 Women Scientists, the Corvallis Pod, Block 15 Brewing, and Tap Talks Corvallis. And please do support these fine organizations, and you can find out how to do that by going to their websites that are shown on this slide. So I'm going to be presenting information from several different projects, quite a few in fact, and they've been funded by a number of different organizations, and I've had teams involved from many different groups, and these are a few of them, some of the major ones in this slide. And I'm super grateful to funders and collaborators for the progress we've made. So these are some things you can bring home from this talk, I hope, by the time I'm done. Answers to these questions. What is a tidal swamp anyway? What do they do for us, for people and fish and other wildlife? How did we learn about them? How have they changed through the years? And what can we do to protect the functions that they provide and to restore them? We are still getting a little background noise from somebody who's not muted. Maybe somebody can try to mute their phone or computer. Thank you. Tidal swamps, to begin with just the definition, they are one type of tidal wetland, and that seems obvious, but it's actually very interesting when you get into the details. Because they are tidal wetlands, they are found in estuaries. And this photo shows an example of an estuary on the Oregon coast. This happens to be the Siletz estuary, with the Siletz River here flowing down to the ocean. This is the Pacific Ocean in the background here. And then you see the sand spit here and the bay. And the light brown areas that are sort of in the middle ground of this picture, those are tidal marshes. So they're tidal wetlands in this estuary. A tidal wetland, like other wetlands, is defined by three main characteristics. It's hydrology, and that's how water moves through the system, the soils, and the vegetation found in the wetland. Tidal wetland hydrology, by definition, the wetland surface, the actual ground surface of the wetland, needs to be inundated during at least some high tides, not every high tide necessarily. The water that inundates the wetland could be salty, it could be brackish, or it could be fresh. We do have what we call the freshwater tidal zone, which is pretty big in some parts of Oregon. These systems can also have freshwater input that's not tidal, like streams and rivers, so they can combine. And this illustration of the tide cycles at the bottom of this slide is courtesy of Jim Good, and I want to thank him for all the amazing work that he did on tidal wetlands in past years. So soils in tidal wetlands have some characteristics that are typical of wetlands in general, like being saturated, but they have some special characteristics as well, like they may be salty. They may have a lot of organic matter, and that is often true for wetlands in general. They can be quite a variety of textures, from sandy to silty and clay soils. On the Oregon coast, they tend to generally be fine textured with silty clay loam soils. In terms of vegetation, these are the three main types of, well, there's actually four pictures shown here of tidal wetland vegetation communities that you would see in tidal wetlands on the Oregon coast. They kind of divide out into marsh on the left and swamp on the right. So marsh means wetlands that's dominated by low-growing grassy plants or sedges, herbaceous vegetation. It's also called an emergent wetland. And we divide these into low marsh and high marsh that you can see in this slide. And then tidal swamp is dominated by woody species. And so when you hear people talk about a swamp, that's what they're referring to, is a wetland that's got shrubs or trees dominating the vegetation. Here's a couple more pictures of tidal marshes on the Oregon coast. And this is an aerial photo from straight up showing what a tidal marsh can look like. So the grassy areas here where you can see these channels flowing out from and into the wetland, those are the tidal channels. This happens to be a tall ridge that's an upland. This is the Drift Creek in the Alsea. Tidal swamp, here's a couple more pictures. The one on the left is a shrub tidal swamp, and on the right, a forested. And when you see those from the air, they look quite different. There's a lot of texture to the vegetation here. This happens to be up in the Columbia, where there are some of the most extensive tidal swamps. And you can see there's taller trees along the channels here. Those are Sitka spruce. And then there's shorter vegetation, actually happens to be shrub swamp in these middle areas. It's a fascinating environment here. So as that previous picture implied, these different wetland classes aren't found just randomly scattered throughout the landscape. They're found in the places where the physical environment is appropriate for their development. And again, Jim Good provided this beautiful diagram that shows how different tidal wetland types might be arrayed in the landscape. So here's the ocean, and then a sand spit like you saw in the picture of the Silettes, and the mouth of the estuary where the river flows out and the tides flow in. Then there would be mud flats, eelgrass beds, and low intertidal habitats like those. Then as you move up the system a little, you'd get tidal marsh. And this picture shows a small area of tidal swamp here at the base of this hill. But in recent years, what we've learned is that there was really much more tidal swamp than that as you moved upriver and up estuary. So I added a little text to Jim's diagram here just to indicate that new knowledge that we've gained more recently. So we're still early enough in the process of learning about tidal swamps that we haven't agreed on our terminology yet. So you might hear people talk about tidal forests. That's the same thing. Tidal forested wetlands, that's also tidal swamps. Forested riverine tidal wetlands is a term that's used some in the freshwater tidal zone. And so there are a number of ways to refer to these types of wetlands. And they are very important to us because, like all tidal wetlands, they provide a lot of different ecosystem services that we care about. These ones that are listed on this slide, which I won't go through in detail, are ecosystem services that are provided by all tidal wetlands. Well, not all of them, but most of them. And habitat and carbon storage, water quality functions, lots of wildlife support functions. You can go to Paul Adams's document that I've linked at the bottom here, and by the way, you can get this talk as a PDF somehow. We'll figure out a way to get this to you after my talk so you can find these links easily. Now, forested tidal wetlands, the swamps that I'm so excited about, have some special functions besides just the general tidal wetland functions. For instance, they provide really interestingly complex tidal channels for fish to hide out in. And those channels, because they're complex and full of woody debris, support a lot of insect life, and so they make very rich fish food. They also hold up water. All the wood in these channels and the nature of the wetlands means that often water stays in these wetlands at low tide. The channels don't empty out, and that gives fish refuge at low tide, which is important for a small fish that isn't ready to go out into the big river, which might have high flows and wash them down to the ocean before they're ready. So this refuge is actually really important. And beaver ponds are part of that picture too, and I'll be talking a little more about that. And then because salmon are anadromous and have to move between fresh and salt water in the course of their life cycle, these wetlands, these forested wetlands, which are found in the fresh to brackish part of the estuary, provide salt adjustment opportunities where fish can move between different salinity zones and gradually get used to salt. There are a lot of other functions. We're only just beginning to learn about what tidal swamps do for us. And we have an expectation that they fill many, many functions, but we just don't have a lot of data yet on things like wildlife support because of their multi-layered vegetation and high plant productivity and food web support. We do have some new data about carbon storage, and I'll show you some of those figures later on. This publication by Boone Kaufman and our team from just this year is linked at the bottom. So what can we do to protect these functions? A lot of people are asking this question now that we've become aware of these swamps. There's a lot of interest in estuaries in general and tidal wetlands in general, but where should we act? What can we restore and how do we do it? And those questions have been asked of tidal marsh for many years, and so we have a fair understanding of how to restore tidal marsh, although we're still learning on that. But we don't have that understanding for tidal swamp yet. We're really at the very beginning stages. So in order to restore swamps, we really do need to know what drives them. What are the physical factors that control where they're found in the landscape? What's the resulting biology in terms of both what grows in a swamp, what lives in a swamp, and the feedback loops that are found within these habitats? What's distinctive compared to tidal marsh? And also where were these habitats historically? Where are they now? Where can they be restored and how? So before getting into some of those technical details, I just want to show some photos because I think that tidal swamps are some of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. Many of the swamps in Oregon are dominated by Sitka spruce. That's the big tree you see in the middle of this picture with me standing in front of it with a kayak paddle. That was in the Nehalem, by the way. This is a tidal swamp in the Siuslaw. Here we have, and I know there's a little lag on these slides, so I apologize if my words aren't quite matching up with what you're seeing, but here is another image of a tidal swamp in the Nehalem, the Columbia, the Siuslaw estuary. These are all rivers in Oregon, for those of you who are out of state. The Yaquina River estuary. A couple more images from the Yaquina that show what the channels look like in these tidal swamps. And I want to take you back to this Nehalem tidal swamp because I want to tell a little story about it. There are many parts of the world where the tides rise and fall maybe a foot or two or even maybe only a few inches, but that's not the Oregon coast. In most of our tidal swamps, the tides rise and fall 6 or 8 feet or even 10 or 12 feet on the larger tide cycles every month of the year. There are a few tides like that. And during the new moon and the full moon, the channel that you see in this picture will fill to the top and then it will overflow into the forest. And one of the most amazing experiences that I've ever had was to walk into this particular tidal forest about 15 years ago. This was in the evening in the summer. And I stayed around while the tide rose up, filled those channels, and then spread into the forest. And just standing there in the forest and to see the forest floor flowing with a foot of moving water was pretty moving, really, for me, too. And it brought the tidal forest to life for me, and it was a real turning point in my understanding. Now, I don't really recommend doing that because being in a flooded forest that has deep channels is not a really safe place to be. It's risky to move around and difficult. But it was definitely a good experience for me to have a better understanding. So there are cottonwood-dominated tidal swamps in Oregon, too, along the Columbia, and Oregon ash swamps in the Columbia as well. So there's a variety of swamps, but the majority are these Sitka spruce swamps on the coast. And also they were in the lower Columbia. So I want to talk a little bit about the process by which we learned about tidal swamps, because it was a learning process for sure. They aren't obvious when you look out at the landscape. So in this picture, you can see a grassy area in the middle, definitely a tidal marsh, we knew that. But what about the forested area in the background? Is that a tidal wetland too? We didn't have an answer to that question for a while. Here's another example from Cox Island in the Siuslaw. That's a nature conservancy preserve. And you can see a big grassy tidal marsh in the middle. It's clearly a tidal wetland. But what about those forested edges? Are they tidal wetlands too? And it gets even harder to figure this out when you're in an altered landscape. Those past pictures were pretty unaltered, but this is a diked area with ditches. And we figured out that the grassy part of this picture is a diked former tidal wetland. We knew that probably was the case. But we also needed to figure out, and did figure out, that the forested area in the background was a tidal swamp. We got there through a timeline of scientific progress that's pretty fascinating. In the it starts back in the 70s and 90s, and I really should just begin by saying we stand on the shoulders of giants, because some of you in on this talk today were involved in this early work in the 70s and 80s when we were first learning about tidal wetlands and estuaries on the coast. And that early work led to a foundational document that's still used today, the Oregon Estuary Plan Book. And it was followed by some additional research and restoration activities like the ones shown in the Salmon River estuary in the lower right here. And that was really focused on tidal marsh specifically. In fact, the Oregon Estuary Plan Book, published in 1987, had a classification system for tidal wetlands, but it didn't include forested tidal wetlands because they were not understood to be part of the system yet, or they were considered so rare or unknown that they really weren't accounted for at all. So we had some work to do, and during the 2000s, the early 2000s, we were doing a bunch of estuary assessment projects, which again, some of you were involved with. And at this time, we had become aware that tidal swamps used to be more common and that they had been lost. And so we included, when we were helping to set priorities for restoration in these estuaries, we included the historic presence of tidal swamp as one of the criteria for prioritization. And then we were aware of tidal swamps, but we didn't yet know much about them. And it really took getting into the mid-2000s and some new technologies for us to learn what we needed to know. And those new technologies included high accuracy GPS and what we call RTK GPS, and then LIDAR, which is a form of radar that detects elevations very accurately. And we used those technologies to begin building a blueprint for restoration in these different habitat types. We wanted to move beyond just restoring marsh, but how would we restore these other shrub and forested tidal wetlands? And we measured water levels and soil conditions, soil carbon content, salinity, and so forth in this project. And we got some great help from the National Geodetic Survey. This is Doug Adams, who measured tidal swamp elevations for us using their new RTK GPS equipment at that time. And they needed a very tall antenna. In the tidal forest, it's really hard to get a good GPS signal. And even with this tall antenna, it was a tough job. So I'm very grateful to them for that early work. Now, in 2009, thanks to the Oregon LIDAR Consortium, we had the first high-resolution elevation data for the whole coast based on remote sensing, and this was a real game changer for all of us who work in estuaries. This is a picture that I created from the LIDAR data showing elevations only for the estuary. The white area is up above tidal range, but the blue and green and orange and yellow are within tidal range, and then the red color indicates areas that are a little bit above the tides. So it's a terrific resource because the level of detail that you can see is tremendous. And so we found LIDAR to be a real leap forward for us. And with these new technologies, we learned some very interesting things. So as you might guess, one of the first questions that we needed to ask was, what is the elevation and what is the salinity in a tidal swamp versus a tidal marsh? There had been an understanding, sort of a received wisdom during the 70s and 80s, that there was a steady elevation gradient. Low marsh is low, high marsh is high, tidal swamp is even higher. And there was also an understanding that tidal swamp with trees and shrubs could only be in fresh water. But that wasn't based on data, at least not data from the Oregon coast. There was very little data from tidal swamps at all. There were some data from the Columbia River estuary, but the Columbia was already quite altered by the 1970s when these data were being collected. So there was a real lack of data. And we've really made it our mission over the last few years to try to fill some of these data gaps and answer these questions. So some of what we've learned so far is that high marsh and tidal swamp can actually occupy a somewhat similar elevation range. They aren't necessarily found one below the other. High marsh and tidal swamp might be at about the same elevation. Now, low marsh is low. That's a fact. Now, if the elevation is similar and you see swamp and marsh at the same elevation, then the salinity is probably different, and that seems to be the additional driver. So a combination of elevation and salinity is what controls the distribution of these habitat types across the landscape. So we found that high marsh, first low marsh is salty, near marine salinity. High marsh is brackish, and tidal swamp can be brackish or it can be fresh, and it can be quite brackish, in fact. Those of you who knew that Sitka spruce can handle salt were right. We've actually found salinities 10 to 15. That's about half of marine salinity at the upper end in the summer in these Sitka spruce swamps, so they can be pretty salty. And that was a very important piece of information because it helps people choose restoration sites and understand these systems better. So in other words, this is a complicated set of relationships between elevation and salinity that control where these wetlands are found. And what's more, it's even more complicated than that because of beaver. Beaver are system engineers that change their environment, and they will build their dams in brackish tidal marsh, another fact that was not much talked about or perhaps not much known until fairly recently. I've taken a bunch of pictures. Whenever I see a beaver dam out in the tidal marsh, I take a picture because it's fascinating. And they also build their dams in brackish and fresh forested and shrub tidal swamps. There's a couple of images there. And the effects of beaver dams in a tidal wetland are pretty much everything. They'll affect the inundation regime, salinity, the soil saturation, water temperature, you name it. Beaver are very important in these systems. And there's been some neat studies on beaver. Heide Diefenderver's thesis was on the morphology of Sitka spruce tidal channels, and she talked quite a bit about how beaver affect that morphology. And beaver are recently recognized up in the Skagit in Puget Sound as contributing greatly to fish habitat. Greg Hood has done some very amazing work showing that Chinook salmon were 3 times more abundant in beaver dam pools in these tidal marsh and shrub wetlands than they were in other parts of the tidal channels. So the beaver are really supporting fish here. And you've probably heard of beaver as engineers, and they do engineer their environment, as I mentioned. But what's interesting is that plants can actually be system engineers too. And the Sitka spruce forms a root platform. You can see at the end of this red arrow in this slide, that platform, and here's another picture. So here you're seeing the stem, the trunk of the Sitka spruce, the buttress here, and then the root platform extending out. And maybe a little better picture from the edge of a cow pasture, so the cattle have kind of trampled it down where you can see a little better what's going on. And these big roots create a platform, and soil will form up at this elevation, a foot or two above the surrounding wetland surface. So they really change their environment. And the platforms themselves, although they are a couple feet above the surrounding wetland, they're pretty thin. They don't go very far below that. So the spruce tend to fall over during storms when the wind is blowing hard, and you get these upturned root platforms that are really quite striking. This is me looking at one in the Nehalem after the 2007 storm. And here's a group of us standing in front of that same root platform showing how big that is. It's pretty impressive. Big and flat, shallow rooting. And like beaver dams, these root platforms affect all the wetland parameters in the surrounding area, so they create quite a bit of diversity and topography. So diversity in topography and in canopy structure is really the characteristic of these swamps. They're dense, they're multi-layered, they have hummocks and low spots, and this really makes exceptional habitat for a lot of wildlife. So a tidal marsh might have an abundance of marsh wrens and shorebirds and wading birds, but a tidal swamp has waterfowl, but also all the songbirds and raptors and owls and flycatchers, warblers and thrushes and you name it, species that you would see in a rich forest too. These multi-layered swamps are really, it's striking to walk around in them and difficult to walk around in them. So you've seen a lot of wood in these pictures, a lot of tree trunks and stems, and when these trees fall, they are retained quite often in the channels and in the soils. They get buried in the soil, they form carbon storage. The woody debris in the channels, as I mentioned before, is important to fish. This quantity of wood in the channels makes a channel look very different from a tidal marsh channel in general. They're hard to photograph because it's dark and you have to crawl around on your hands and knees to get around in these channels. But you can imagine that they make really good shelter for salmon because they're so well covered up. And these are examples of the pools that form at low tide, and salmon can hang out in here until the tide returns. So in terms of where these tidal swamps are located in the landscape, I'd like to talk about that now and how we figured out where they are. During the 2010s, we did a bunch of mapping work, and this really improved our understanding of the landscape. The first part of this, the first phase, was where we teamed with the Oregon Coastal Management Program to do elevation-based estuary habitat mapping. And Oregon, by the way, is the first state that has done this coastwide in the country, so I'm pretty proud of us for that. And in the 20-teens, late 20-teens, the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership used these same methods to map estuary habitats for the whole West Coast, which is very exciting. And there were some follow-up studies from this new mapping work, and I won't go through all of them, but I do want to focus on these two that are highlighted because they're the most related to my topic today. These are the studies that answered the question, where are the tidal swamps? Where were they in the past, and where are they now? The project that really enabled us to begin this mapping work was this team effort with the OCMP. Andy Lanier headed this project up. And our goals in this project were to update Oregon's estuary habitat maps, and we did that. And we wanted to do it in a certain way. We wanted to make sure we mapped the full historical extent of each estuary from ocean all the way to head of tide, and that we included all the tidal wetlands, not just the salty ones, but also the freshwater tidal wetlands, and that we also included former tidal wetlands that are diked because those are potential restoration areas, and that's pretty important to know where those are. And in case you're not familiar with what these diked lands look like, these diked former tidal wetlands are found in pretty much all of our estuaries, unless they're really tiny. And in this picture, you can see at the top an undiked natural tidal marsh, some of these areas in here. Then you can see a dike running along the edge of the river here, and it becomes a road here. And the area behind that dike is a diked pasture. And on the other side of the river here, you can see another diked site, but this dike has been breached, where my pointer is right now, and that is allowing this wetland to restore to tidal conditions. So it's a restoring tidal wetland. Dikes look on the ground like just an elevated berm. So at the upper left, you can see this is a big dike in the Netherlands, a big, tall, broad dike. Now, Oregon dikes are usually not quite that gigantic, although some are pretty big. These are perhaps more typical dikes. This is at high tide, so there's water inside the dike because it's been raining hard, it's super wet, and also this is a restoration site. But anyway, there's a remnant dike here, and then here's another site at high tide where there's just a little dike. Now, almost all of these dikes, at some point at least, have or had tide gates in them to let the fresh water flow out and then block the tides from coming in. And these are pictures of a couple of those tide gates. They're basically flaps that hang down, and when the tide pushes on them, they close. So having given you a little glimpse of what dikes and tide gates look like, now I'll go back to our mapping effort. And when we mapped these wetlands, we needed to create both a downslope boundary on the sea side and then an upslope boundary on the land side. And the downslope boundary for the estuary is fairly easy to see on photos. If you want to map a vegetated tidal wetland, you can see the edge of the vegetation. But on the upslope side, it's really a question of modeling water levels. You need to look at what's the annual high tide elevation, because that's the definition of the boundary of the estuary from various regulatory and scientific sources. And so what we did was map that high tide line using LIDAR. And I'll show you an example from the Tillamook estuary. So in this map, you can see Tillamook Bay at the upper left here. And then you can see in the middle of the picture a bunch of agricultural lands. Various rivers flow into these broad lowlands here. And the estuary occupies much of the ground that you see in this picture, although nowhere near all of it. Now, this red circle is the area I'm going to zoom in on. This is the Tillamook River, part of the estuary, the Tillamook Bay Estuary. These are agricultural lands. And looking at this picture, this map, you can't really see where the tidal wetlands used to be. It's not at all obvious. This is where we really need our elevation data. So using our LiDAR elevation data, we're able to map the elevation of the annual high tide, which forms the historical estuary boundary. And that's the black line that you see here. So the blue and green and yellow and orange areas are within tide range, but the red and pink aren't. So that's how we mapped our estuary, our historical estuary extent. And it's a very handy boundary to know about because you can ask questions about what's inside the boundary now and what was inside the boundary historically. And that's just what I did in this project that I finished up about a year ago. And in this project, I compared wetland loss by habitat type. I shouldn't say I did it all myself. Much of these data came from the partners that I've been talking about, OCMP and PMAP. And we compared losses among these major classes: emergent, tidal marsh, shrub swamp, and forested swamp. And we did this study because our earlier estuary assessments had suggested that we'd lost a lot of swamp, and people need to know whether that means swamp should be a priority for their estuary, and we needed to get those data for the whole coast. So this was a pretty exciting project. We studied this in 15 estuaries that represent 97% of the historical tidal wetland area for the Oregon coast. So we knew we were getting the data we needed. And we overlaid 4 maps to answer this question of where were the swamps then and where are they now. And those 4 maps were the historical extent of the estuary, historical vegetation, current vegetation, and diked areas, which 3 of those data sources came from this same OCMP project. The historical vegetation, though, came from these historical maps that are found at INR, the Institute for Natural Resources. So here on the left, upper left, you can see historical estuary extent. That's that black line. Upper right, you can see the orange diked areas. Lower left, you see historical vegetation, which was mostly green, which was forested. Lower right, you see current vegetation, and within this estuary area, most of it's emergent now, not forested. So this illustrates 2 different types of wetland loss, one being loss due to diking and one being a loss due to vegetation conversion, where forested tidal wetland is no longer a forested tidal wetland because it's not forested. And what we learned, the first really cool thing that we learned was that over half of the Oregon coast's tidal wetlands were forested rather than tidal marsh. And that was actually that's a new understanding and an important one. This really means that we need to shift our focus from just looking at restoring tidal marsh to trying to restore tidal swamps as well. The losses of historical tidal swamp were much higher than the losses of marsh. We've lost over 95% of our tidal swamps versus around 60% of tidal marshes, and we actually have gained back quite a few tidal marshes due to various factors that I will mention. So this bar chart shows the same image, or the same interesting information with tidal wetland area on the y-axis here, and then the left-hand bar shows historical conditions. Blue is tidal marsh, the green colors are tidal swamp, dark green is forested. And you can see historically it was mostly over half forested, but now very little forested tidal wetland remains. And this is a map from the Tillamook, and in this report, there are links in my slideshow to the report, you can find these maps. In this map, the blue represents historical tidal swamp in the Tillamook estuary, and the red represents remaining tidal swamp. The darker gray is historical tidal marsh. So this is just a way of illustrating how much things have changed. There's not a lot of this tidal swamp left, which is why we didn't know much about it for so long, because it was escaping our consciousness by its rarity. And this is the Coquille River estuary, where nearly 100% of tidal forests have been lost despite the fact that 84% of the historical tidal wetlands in that whole estuary were forested. So that's a huge change. Diking has affected more of the tidal swamps than marshes. 68% of swamps diked versus 44% of marsh. And vegetation conversion, that is logging, affected tidal swamps more than marshes as well. You can see in this map, there's a couple different kinds of maps in this report, and this is the map that shows the diked areas in red. So it just shows the prevalence of these diked areas. Here's one for the Aquina estuary, showing the diked areas in red, and the Owl Sea. So you can explore these maps and learn about where all these areas are. Oh, I mentioned that we've gained back some tidal marsh. We've actually gained back 1,770 hectares of new tidal marsh. This isn't even restoration. This is just new marsh that has formed through accretion or deposition of sediment. And the fact that we've been gaining marsh, not losing it to erosion, is actually a positive for our coast. It suggests that under our conditions, tidal wetlands may be relatively resilient compared to other parts of the U.S. coast under sea level rise. Some of this new marsh is shown in this map, this darker blue here. That's all new marsh formed since the mid-1800s. It's pretty interesting. So again, the report is here, and there's also a web app where you can explore these data thanks to my wonderful GIS colleagues at Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. I could never have created a web app like this, so I'm very grateful to them. And just very briefly, I want to point out that the Oregon coast is not alone in its loss of tidal swamp. The Columbia River estuary has had huge losses of tidal swamp too. This shows the Columbia River flowing to the ocean, and Reach B down here near the mouth. This is a graph showing the change in wetland area for different wetland types, and I'm going to focus just on the red circled ones. This reach has had an 82% loss of tidal forest versus a 30 to 35% loss for shrub and marsh. That's a big change. And similar to the Oregon coast, and in the Snohomish River estuary, up in Puget Sound, this is near Everett, Washington, there's been a similarly very high loss of forested tidal wetlands, 90%. They've basically lost all their shrub wetlands from this estuary, and emergent, they've lost about 65%. So, and by the way, these data are almost identical for the whole Puget Sound area. So forested wetlands have been disproportionately impacted. And you might ask what happened to them. Inquiring minds want to know. As you might have guessed, a lot of them have been diked and converted to pasture on the Oregon coast. And this is what some of them look like now. Also, they were logged, and this began during the early 1900s, in the teens and into World War I, when spruce trees were cut for aircraft frames during World War I and beyond. And diking followed logging in many cases. But these spruce that were growing near the rivers were a lot easier to transport than spruce way up on the hills. You could just drop them into the water or drag them over to the water and float them downriver. And the impacts of the loss of these tidal swamps were diverse because the functions of the tidal swamps were diverse. So I don't need to go through these functions again, but when you convert these to a pasture, you gain pasture and you gain an economic proposition for growing livestock, but you lose all these other economic prospects of growing fish and slowing floodwaters and so forth. You lose carbon storage too, and I actually want to show some pictures from that recent study that Boone Kaufman and our team have published. So this graph shows carbon storage per hectare in soil, that's orange, and then in above ground plant material, that's green, for a range of different habitat types. You probably can't read all these titles, but these are different types of wetlands across the world. And on the right, you can see Pacific Northwest tidal forests. That's this tall bar here. And this shows the amount of carbon per hectare stored is higher for our Pacific Northwest tidal forests than just about anywhere else in the world. So it's pretty amazing. compared to other forest habitats in Oregon, again, the tidal forest is way up there. The only type of forest habitat that tends to store even more carbon is the coastal old-growth upland forest. So these are important resources for a lot of different reasons, and that's why people want to restore them. And I'm going to finish with some information for you about how we can restore tidal swamps since we've lost so many of them. So one of the first things you have to do is choose the right site, and that isn't as easy as it sounds. So we've got some information out about that. And then you take down the dikes and bring the water back, bring the sediment back, and then re-excavate channels if necessary. Woody plantings are usually needed as well. But there are some challenges, and one of them is that the soils in these tidal wetlands, not just the swamps but marshes too, when they're diked off, the soil sinks because we lose the organic matter and we lose flotation due to them being wet all the time, and they get compacted. And being highly organic soils, they compact a lot. So they may be too low now. A lot of the places that were tidal swamp historically might be too low now. But that doesn't mean you can't find another place in the landscape to restore a tidal swamp. There are many other changes to these diked areas like ditching that have reduced the number of channels by an order of magnitude. And that means conditions are different. You get ponding, you might get more salinity during warm summer days that might make conditions a little bit difficult for a tree. We also have reed canary grass, which is an invasive species that we need to control in order to get woody plantings established. And there are some people doing some really neat innovative techniques on this. Here are some log cribs that Jake Robinson has been using in the Coquille, and he is using them to plant Sitka spruce saplings inside these elevated areas, give them a head start against the reed canary grass. And these also are attached to posts where they can float on a high tide. It's a pretty neat system. And it has yet to be monitored for much time, but here's 4 years worth of growth of some spruce trees in a log crib, and they do seem to be pretty happy. So this may be a good technique. Nurse logs have been used as well. And soil mounds are another possibility. So sea level rise, I'm not going to dwell on it. It's an issue, obviously. We need to be aware of it. We've done some studies to map potential future tidal wetlands. People can use those to try to find a good spot for restoring future tidal swamp. And then many of these same innovative methods will help deal with sea level rise too. And some of the characteristics of the swamps themselves will help as well, like these root platforms and beaver activity. So in summary, I hope I've convinced you that tidal swamps are A, super interesting, B, historically very important, C, a lot of them are gone, and also that they served a bunch of functions that we care deeply about, and that we can do things to bring them back. We can help restore them. There are many groups working on this now. If you are interested in what you personally can do, I really recommend getting in touch with our coastal watershed councils. These are wonderful organizations. I've worked with them from the beginning of my activity in Oregon, and they are nationally in a leadership position of bringing people together to work on watershed health and benefit local communities. So look them up, please. And I hope I've answered all these questions. I ticked them all off. I guess that means I answered them. And I hope you will join me in bringing back tidal forests to our coast. And I want to invite you to ask any questions. I didn't hear any coming up during my talk, so now is a great time to have some conversation. So maybe Mary can unmute.
Yes, thank you, Laura. We have a question from John Marshall, and I'm just going to unmute John and invite him to come and ask his question.
Hi, John.
You got a message, John, to unmute.
Hi, Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So you Yeah, my cat's got a hold of my sweater here. Anyway, you alluded to some relatively progressive restoration techniques for tidal swamps with the cribs and the nurse logs, which are in fact mimicking in situ processes that occurred naturally in pre-disturbed, pre-European influence when old growth forests were immediately adjacent to these prograding high marshes, and the wind storms would create the windfall and the nurse logs that would allow those spruce and hemlock and cedar to come in and colonize those logs and then start those swamps, and then those would in turn progress over time and become old growth forests unto themselves. And so I think that's a really a wise and a good strategy for getting those establishments
I agree.
initially going.
Thank you.
My question is, back when I was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you may remember this, I sometimes at meetings would make recommendations for our agency and the National Marine Fisheries Service to look at the restoration potential of old growth tidal swamps as late successional reserves for northern spotted owls and marble murrelets, and for the variety of salmonids, threatened and endangered salmonids that use those tidal channels for refuge and for feeding and transition from freshwater to marine systems. And I was just wondering, I haven't been with the Fish and Wildlife Service for over 10 years, and I haven't heard, do you know if those Section 7 Endangered Species Act funds were ever used for that purpose, for the restoration and establishment of old growth swamps? And I guess the follow-up question to that is, what is your organization's look at the long-term management and protection of those systems so that they will eventually become those old growth systems? Again, of course, that's, we can show trends, status and trends towards that objective, but we won't see the actual results of that way past our lifetimes. So
Right.
That's what my question is. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Fish and Wildlife Service, whether it's specifically Magnuson-Stevens or other funds, Fish and Wildlife Service has been one of the big funders that has allowed us to characterize these systems, monitor them, and understand them. So they've been extremely important in this process. And in terms of where we are with protecting these systems so they can become old growth, the first step in that process has been even just mapping them, knowing where they were historically and knowing where they are now. And we're just getting that done now. So the next steps are to protect them, and that's super important. And I think that's going to be a process of working with land use planning and with private landowners and public. We're working on it, and it's a priority for the groups I work with. So I think we've made good progress actually in the last decade on that. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next question's from Laura Taylor. Laura, would you like, I can ask the question for you, or do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to ask it. Yeah, so when I read the title of your talk, I immediately thought of the interdune pond systems down in the Oregon dunes, and that was like my image of a coastal swamp on the Oregon coast. So I'm wondering, how are those similar or different? Are there particular things that differentiate them, and would you consider them part of this system? And anything cool in particular about them?
Oh, I think they're fascinating. Especially when you get into some of the stunted Sitka spruce and shore pine environments. They're so tangled and interesting. They're even harder to walk through than Sitka spruce tidal swamp. They're similar only in that they are forested wetlands, but usually they're not salty unless they get sea spray, which certainly does happen. So I guess they're salty in that sense. I don't actually know what the salinities are in the interdunal swale wetlands. There may be some salinity. They usually don't have the rise and fall of the tides to create dynamic water tables, and those are considered pretty important to a lot of processes of soil biota and so forth. They intergrade in some places. It was one of the challenges with our mapping work was, here are some dunal systems where the interdunal swale is below the annual high tide line, but is it or is it not connected with a surface water connection? Doesn't seem to be, but does the groundwater rise and fall with the tides? Probably. No one has studied that. There's a bunch of interesting questions that would be fun to investigate about these dunal systems. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Next question's from Sunkai. Would you like to ask the question, Sunkai?
Sure. I'm just wondering about latitudinal variability and conditions, historical, present, and projected future for supporting these tidal swamp environments in Oregon.
Yeah, well, they don't, the Sitka spruce doesn't extend very far south. So I would guess Northern California is the limit. So with temperatures rising, it could be that this system will shrink back northwards. I can't say it would expand further north because we already have Sitka spruce swamps up in Alaska. So, but the boundaries will probably pull back as climate warms. In terms of salinity and so forth too, there will be increasing penetration of salinity farther into the estuaries, which will make conditions a little saltier than the trees might like. So we'll probably see expansion of marshes inwards. Away from the ocean, and again, retreat of some of these tidal swamps. But this is where the engineering, the sort of system engineering capabilities of the spruce come in, because by elevating their root platforms above the surrounding hydric soil, they can live in a fresher environment than you would think. They have fine roots that can take advantage of rainfall and air at low tide, and it's a complicated enough system that it's going to be interesting and challenging to try to even predict what will happen into the future with climate change.
Great. Next question's from Chris. Would you like to ask your question, Chris, or should I ask it for you? I can ask it. Chris asks, other than donating money to the worthy group supporting such efforts, what else can a non-coastal person do to help restore and protect tidal swamps?
Well, when you say you're non-coastal, I gather that means you can't get to the coast and volunteer on a project. I would say if you're able to do any educational efforts, there could be outreach that you could help with. I work with several groups that try to put together educational information and outreach materials. So if you have skills along those lines, that would be super helpful. Educate yourself about the nature of these environments and then get the word out. We really still need to get the word out about tidal swamps. Too many times I'm in a meeting and I hear people speak of tidal wetlands and salt marsh as the same thing. If it's a tidal wetland, it's a salt marsh, and so we're still working on getting the word out. So that's definitely something you could help with.
Great. Great answer. And next question is from Paul Engelmeyer. Do you want to go ahead, Paul, and ask your question?
Sure. Hello, Laura. Great talk.
Hi, Paul.
Yeah. Hey, so I'm wondering, have you seen any experimentation of beaver dam analogs in potential forested habitat?
Not in Oregon. Well, okay, potential forested habitat, I would say non-tidal, it's probably being done, yes. I don't work in that area, so I'm not as sure. Within the tidal swamps themselves, within restoration sites, I'm sure that's being considered. I think I may have heard something about some work to create initiation points for beaver in tidal wetlands in the Columbia system. I know down in the Klamath they're working on beaver dam analogs in some of the forested wetlands in the lower Klamath. So yes, it's happening. I haven't personally been involved in a project yet. We're still sort of at the stage where we're trying to find a spot that will restore a tidal swamp and just get the dikes down. And beaver often will just come back into those areas because they're so well suited but the beaver dam analogs I know are also very important in some areas because perhaps beaver won't recolonize or they need help. So I wish I were a little more educated about that, honestly, Paul. It's a good question.
Well, I've got a little project and I'll keep you appraised of it, and we'll love to have your expertise on that in the future.
Thank you.
Great question. Next question is from Barbara Hudson Hanley. And you can go ahead and ask a question, Barbara.
Thank you, Mary. Laura, great talk, so informative. You mentioned the sea level rise and the effect that that's going to have on the tidal wetlands and the tidal swamps. And I was wondering if we can expect the tidal swamps to become low marshes as an effect from sea level rise. And if so, in Oregon, given the topography, do you expect that to be a gradual change or a more punctuated change like what we saw with Hurricane Sandy and the East Coast?
Very good question. I think I expect it to be more gradual because the Oregon coast is, our estuaries are primarily sheltered behind these sand spits, and then you have a bay that opens out, and then you have a more confined river valley extending upslope, which perhaps those upriver areas where tidal swamps are currently found and were predominantly historically found are not subject to the kinds of coastal storm action that you would see, say, on the Gulf Coast. So I think the process is likely to be more gradual than punctuated. And one of the things that I've been trying to emphasize is we just don't know, because there are frequent and rapid and constant changes to predictions of what sea level rise will look like. We don't know how fast the transitions will occur. And we don't yet understand the complexities of how changing precipitation patterns will interact with sea level rise and change salinity regimes and so forth. So there's all these unknowns. So what I think the best strategy is to identify areas in the landscape where we have a gradual slope up from our current tidal wetland array, a gradual slope up into floodplain environments, and try to focus efforts in those areas so that as conditions change, there's somewhere for this full gamut of wetland types to go, from low marsh to high marsh to swamp. There's a retreat zone for all these types, and there's room for all of them. Now, there aren't a ton of places like that on the coast, but there are some, and a lot of those floodplains are upland now. They're not wetland, or maybe they're seasonal wetlands. But instead of just looking at the current wetlands that are tidal, we sort of need to look a little farther upslope and into the broader landscape to find these continuums of riparian and wetland habitats and really focus efforts there so we have flexibility into the future.
Thank you.
Next question is from Robert, who didn't unmute. His question is, do Kaufman et al. Have data showing temporal patterns of organic matter accretion? Is there a plateau effect? Oh, here he is. No?
Could you ask the beginning of that question again?
I thought I was going to jump in. It says, do Kaufman et al. Have data showing temporal patterns of organic matter accretion? Is there a plateau effect, or does accretion build in some other pattern?
Yeah, interesting question. No, we didn't look at temporal patterns on a shorter term temporal cycle, if you mean, say, within tide cycles or seasonally or year-to-year variability. We looked at the total carbon contents of the soil, what they call carbon stocks. And we have looked at strata within the soil and the amount of carbon in each stratum, but there are some complexities to trying to understand the patterns across years of carbon deposition. So I would say that's a pretty open field still in understanding how organic matter is deposited in the soil, especially in swamps versus marshes, for instance. We're in the early stages of studying this here in the Northwest. There were basically no broad soil carbon data from the Northwest until very recently. It was a huge data gap.
Did that answer your question, Robert? You're unmuted now, so you can.
Yes, excellent. And I look forward to getting in touch with Laura about some carbon sequestration projects in the near future.
Cool. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
Next question's from Ben Pettinger. I've asked you to unmute, Ben, unless you'd like me to ask the question for you. Oh, there you go.
I'm sorry, mine was more of a comment than just, I work with the Lower Nehalem Community Trust. I mentioned that if people who don't live on the coast time their visits around our volunteer periods, you can come out and help with restoration through land trusts on the coast.
Thank you. Very good suggestion. You could put into the chat window your contact information for the land trust if you'd like, and then people could get in touch with you.
Chris asked a question about the names of the groups that people can web search and volunteer for. We can send those out with the slides, Chris. I think that'd probably be the easiest.
Good idea.
I'm going through messages. And Zunkai's got another question. I have to go find unmute. You can ask the question, Zunkai, if you like.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry for the second question, but with a lot of these systems where you have multiple landowners behind a tide gate, and say you have one willing landowner to do some work, so working within that constraint, what sort of opportunities and limitations are there for tidal swamp restoration?
That's a really good question. Well, if you have a tide gate on the outside of a system and one landowner inside wants to restore and others don't, you can't take the tide gate off, you can't remove the dike, but you could restore wetlands that are non-tidal. And a non-tidal forested wetland or shrub wetland is still a valuable resource. So if that can be done in as natural a way as possible, let's say not using a water control structure that requires constant maintenance, but using natural water sources and attempting to allow nature to build the processes and build the habitat, that can be valuable too. I mean, I've seen abandoned ag lands that have grown up into willows that are harboring a lot of wildlife. So there's not a lack of opportunity in that situation. It's just different.
Thank you.
Next question, we've got lots of questions. Next question is from Kay Mooney. You can ask the question yourself, or Maroney, or I can ask it. The question is, what are your thoughts about filling diked areas to restore elevation prior to or during dike breaching, or even designing higher elevations in the project area for forest swamp restoration? Regulating agencies in Oregon seem to be hesitant to this idea compared to California, where this is often almost a standard restoration technique.
Well, one thing is we have intact sediment supplies in Oregon, so our accretion rates are pretty good here, and we have pretty good natural processes for bringing in sediment. People don't have to do that. Our rivers, when they flood, bring in a lot of sediment. But I understand sea level rise may be even more rapid than that, so we're concerned about that. The only thing with adding fill material essentially to a wetland is it's fraught with peril. It has to be done right. It has to be done very carefully with good ecological basis for the work. And if you're going to build soil structures, you have to make sure they're not going to block tidal flows or cause invasive species to come in. So there's a lot of concerns, rightly so, among the agencies about putting fill material in wetlands. You know, most people have very good motivations, but there can be problems with filling a wetland, obviously. So if it's not done right, I'd be very cautious with that kind of approach. Now, in California, they often have to do this. They're losing their marsh right now. It's drowning and dying for various reasons, and they don't have good sediment sources because of dams on the rivers or because of low precipitation and not the flows that would carry the sediment. Although some places have tons of sediment deposited during floods. So it varies from place to place, but I think the concern on the part of the state agencies is warranted.
And that is about all of our questions. Joy Thompson asked, is it possible to watch the recording of this meeting later? I hope so. I'm recording it to the cloud, so technology granted. Hopefully that works well and you will get to see that again in all its completeness. And there are a few more comments in the chat that you can read through and some links to the Nehalem Community Trust. And Ben's added some more comments there. I'd like to say, given the time, thank you so to everybody, to Laura especially, for giving such a fabulous, wonderful talk.
Thank you all for coming.
And I'd like to just let you know that we have another TAP talk on the first Tuesday of next month, which would be January 5th. And that would be Dr. Erica Lavella will be talking about the art of metabolism, the microbiome, and staying well, because we'll all be thinking about our guts in January and how we're going to live a healthier life. So check out Facebook, TAP Talks Facebook, contact us at Gmail, at the 500 Women Scientists Gmail account if you want more information. We will send out links to the recording. Probably just send it to everybody who registered, might be the easiest. And if you have a moment, always remember to, you know, donate some money to 500 Women Scientists, would like it. It's Giving Tuesday. And with that, if everybody wants to hit their reaction button to say big thumbs up to Laura for such a wonderful talk, that would be great. So
thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thanks to all the organizers and all you attendees. It was fun.
It was.
See you another time.
My first time doing such a big group.